Hello everybody, it's me, Cloud Connection, from the future. So the video you're about to watch, I originally intended to release in October of last year, but midway through the editing I realized I wasn't a fan of how it was progressing, so I shelved it. But if you saw my latest update post, then you'll know that this channel, Cloud Connection, is going to be ending soon as I move on to a new channel. If you want to learn more about that, you can check the community tab. I'll have a video announcement here as well. But in the meantime, I figured, why not finish this video and release it just so it's off my table and you guys get a little bonus video while I wrap things up here. So enjoy, and thanks for watching. So my mind's been on The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time a lot over the past few weeks. I recently did another OOT randomizer playthrough over on my livestream channel with my pal Gaming Navi, and it started me thinking about the game's dungeons. Now, not being a hardcore Zelda fan, I can't claim to be an expert on the franchise's dungeon design as a whole, but with how many times I've played Ocarina of Time, I've had a lot of experience trekking through this set of dungeons. Which got me thinking, which Ocarina of Time dungeons are the best? And which ones do I hope I never have to traverse through again? For this video, I'm ranking all 8 dungeons that grant you a spiritual stone or medallion, plus Bottom of the Well, the Ice Cavern, the Gerudo Training Ground, and Ganons Castle. I'm judging them on a couple of criteria, including layout and design, challenges, including puzzles, enemy placement, and platforming, how fun they are to explore, the bosses and mini-bosses, and to a lesser extent, the items you gain within. And as a quick note, this list is just my opinion. Yours will be different, don't be a jerk if you don't agree, blah blah blah, you get the idea. With that all out of the way, here's every dungeon in Ocarina of Time ranked. Number 12, the Ice Cavern. Out of all this game's dungeons, this is this is part of the quest one. I usually forget about this place, and whenever I do remember it, I never think about it for long. It's not that there are any egregious design elements or poor challenges, but there's nothing exciting or even intriguing about this place. You come to this area after returning to Zora's domain and finding it frozen, with King Zora being the only inhabitant still there, albeit imprisoned in red ice. So you take a detour into the Ice Cavern and find the items necessary to thaw him out, and that's it. In fairness, that is how every dungeon works at its foundation, but this dungeon does nothing to elevate it above that most basic level. There aren't that many enemies and encounters to spruce things up. And when there is, it's usually ice keys, which are far more annoying thanks to their ability to freeze you. The objectives aren't much better either, as this is a very straightforward location. This is the first dungeon where you collect silver rupees to proceed, and while these tasks aren't terrible, it always seems like a cheaper alternative to organic puzzles. You're forced down a linear path, which does branch out around the middle, but you are railroaded through the entire thing, which doesn't help its case. Its items might be its worst quality. The iron boots are infamous, and while its problems don't rear around here, having them be the ultimate reward for this part is a raw deal in hindsight. As for the blue fire, it has no function other than just opening the path forward. It'd be cool if you could harness it in another way than just dropping it on the ground, but as it stands, it's just a key card. Aesthetically, this place isn't horrible, but it doesn't have a distinct enough flavor. Compared to the untouched natural feeling of the child dungeons, or the crafted architecture of the temples, the Ice Cavern feels neither organic enough to be a regular old cave, nor designed well enough to be a fun level. Add to that one of the weakest music tracks in the game, and you get a dungeon that doesn't feel like it's trying to do much, and what it does isn't very engaging. Thankfully, while this is the least exciting dungeon, it's also the shortest. But that means it also doesn't have enough time to make an impression, leaving a lot to be desired. Number 11, inside Jabu's belly. While this dungeon has one of the more unique aesthetics in this game, taking place inside a giant fish god, it also has perhaps the worst design and puzzles of them all. Let's start with those aesthetics though. I love the naturally twisting guts and intestines, but that's about all I care for. The lack of variety in the wall and floor textures makes it hard for each room to stand out. And the music track is once again pretty forgettable and loops too quickly. This final room is memorable, as its guts and bones is pretty cool, but a lot of these hallways are far too identical. And technically, the explore a living being for a dungeon idea isn't even unique, since that is literally the first thing that Link did. Anyway, your enjoyment of this dungeon will depend on whether you're fine with hauling Ruto around. I like Ruto as a character because her personality is pretty fun, but she feels like a big waste as a puzzle object. Not that I don't like the idea, the concept of two people swallowed by a creature and forced to make their way out is a good one. but it doesn't amount to more than using Ruto to just activate switches. You do this often enough for it to be a drag, and it makes me wish they integrated her in a more involved way. Like possibly control her for a small section, or let her walk around and activate switches independently. It makes this dungeon feel more boring than it has any right to be as the final major dungeon during the child section. And while it's fitting that this is the hardest of the first 3 dungeons, a lot of that comes from frustration rather than good challenge. Navigating between the 2 floors takes far too long thanks to the lack of pathways upwards. And taking the wrong step in this room with the pitfalls just wastes your time even more. This dungeon isn't the biggest, but so much of it is wasted space, making it feel simultaneously claustrophobic and way too dense. Plus, its boss fights are pretty mediocre. I've never cared for the big Octo fight, since it feels like an arbitrary obstacle which isn't challenging nor enjoyable to defeat. And Baronade is one of my least favorite bosses in the game. It takes far too long, and the boomerang feels too unwieldy against this thing. Speaking of the boomerang, while this is a solid item, I don't think it's used to spectacular effect here. Most of its usage in this dungeon is attacking these tentacles simply because it's the only weapon effective against them. Although I do like how the last room forces you to use its curving arc to hit this final switch. This room really has it all, huh? Inside Jabu Jabu's belly is a pretty lackluster finale to the child section, and one that I never enjoyed traveling through. While it gets points above the Ice Cavern for at least not being totally forgettable and having a more unique visual style, it has far too many trappings for it to even reach the top 10 in a list of 12. It's also weird how these 2 dungeons are technically right next to each other on the map, even if they're displaced by 7 years. I blame King Zora for this. Number 10, the Gerudo Training Ground. As an optional part of the adventure, the Gerudo Training Ground is an otherwise solid dungeon that is let down significantly by one horrendous black mark. But we'll talk about that later. Let's get the positives out of the way first. Ocarina of Time doesn't have a ton of involved side quests. The only others that come to mind are the Bigoron Sword trading quest and maybe the Happy Mask shop, so having a full-on optional dungeon in this game to begin with is pretty sweet. This dungeon is far more segmented, mostly being a collection of little trials that test your skills with almost every major item. You can navigate through it a few different ways, and if you know what you're doing, you can skip some of them entirely. And it isn't merely a repeat of the challenges in other dungeons, although that is sometimes the case. It's not afraid to do something unique or put a new spin on something you're familiar with. It helps that every room has a different look, incorporating a couple of different themes while still feeling connected. That's all well and good, but let's address the thing that sinks this dungeon down towards the bottom: the reward. The ice arrows are not worth the effort and are essentially a big screw you at the end of an otherwise well-made dungeon. As you probably already know, the ice arrows are 100% useless. You can use them to freeze enemies, but this has so little advantage in combat that it isn't worth the effort. And while it technically has some niche applications, the vast majority have to be dealt with before you can complete the Gerudo Training Ground. Technically, the fire arrows and light arrows have just as little combat practicality, but at least the fire arrows are useful for shooting torches from far away, and the light arrows are required to take down Ganondorf. On some level, it is unfair to judge the Gerudo Training Ground solely on the merit of its reward, as it is otherwise a decent side area that is fun to go through. But a side quest as long as this should give you at least some incentive rather than just the thrill of completing it. The Bigoron quest gives you a new weapon that grants better offense, but this gives you no such satisfaction. It's designed well enough, but it has that one sour spot that prevents it from reaching any higher. Number 9, the bottom of the well. This area has some of the same issues as the Ice Cavern, as it can't help but feel like a way to pad out the path to the Shadow Temple. But it is at least an enjoyable side trip with some good atmosphere and, unlike the Ice Cavern, some actual things to do. If you're just following the main story, this is the first time you really notice how events are connected between these 2 time periods, as it demonstrates how the knowledge Link gains as a child or an adult affects his other form. This was already a thing with all the unlocked doors and areas, to be fair, but the bottom of the well is the first time it's overtly demonstrated to you. Being forced to return to Child Link to find an item tucked away is an intriguing choice, and sending him to a hidden area under the well in Kakariko Village is a memorable set piece. While the bottom of the well isn't a large dungeon, there's plenty of rooms to explore, a few traps that force you to climb back up to the top of the map, and a surprising amount of danger present. You encounter enemies here that you've only ever fought as an adult, and dealing with them as a child is doable, but is the greatest non-boss challenge to date. And speaking of bosses, let's talk about Dead Hand, which is infamously scary in its grotesque appearance that is severely messed up. But the fight also forces you to put yourself in peril in order to beat the boss. Having to fall into Dead Hand's grasp to summon him would be terrifying even if he didn't look so monstrous, and it makes this enemy stick out in your mind. It's also the most brain-teasing child dungeon in the game, as while the puzzles aren't bad compared to the temples before and after it, it is a significant step up from inside Jabu Jabu's belly, with dead-end paths and, again, plenty of hazards to avoid. Part of that comes from the fake walls and floors, which makes this dungeon infinitely trickier, since you're never quite sure what tiles you can step on and which will send you plummeting to the bottom. It's nice that the dungeon reward, the Lens of Truth, is the way you reveal these secrets, as you can then experiment with the rest of the dungeon and find anything you missed. Technically, you can just drain the water, fight Dead Hand, get the Lens of Truth and skedaddle, but there's quite a few goodies you can find in this place that makes it worth exploring. This would be higher on the list if it was expanded into its own dungeon, as while it is cool in a bubble, it can't help but feel tethered to the Shadow Temple, and the comparisons makes the bottom of the well feel all the lesser as a result. It shares the same music and general vibe as that dungeon, and because of that, it's hard to think of them as separate entities. Because of its relatively minor role in the quest, it doesn't have as long to sink its hooks into you, but the hooks it does sink in make it, at the very least, a good dungeon to explore. Number 8. The Water Temple. If you've played Ocarina of Time, you already know why the Water Temple is so infamous. If you haven't, you also probably know why the Water Temple is so infamous. I mean, this thing has its own dedicated Wikipedia page. Not many video game levels hold that distinction. It has a reputation, and the fact that I didn't immediately put it in the number 12 position probably ruffled some of your feathers. While I don't think it's the absolute worst, it can definitely be daunting if you're unprepared for it. Many of the frustrations come from the repetitive use of the iron boots, specifically the need to constantly equip and de-equip them from Link's person. The iron boots really only perform one function, letting Link walk underwater, with no reason to have them equipped on any other part of the dungeon. This is more of a mechanical issue related to the game rather than the level itself, as Ocarina of Time 3D was nowhere near as irritating on this front with its implementation of the boots as items. Yet for many, it's a crucial linchpin that brings this dungeon down. Another problem people have with it is its design. On paper, the level should be easy to navigate since it's based around a central pillar, only branching out in cardinal directions on a few floors. But in practice, the interconnected nature of some of these paths makes you feel like you're going in circles. That's not helped by having to raise and lower the water level, as if you need to reset the water level to where it was, you have to backtrack through some of the dungeon. I understand keeping the player guided along a pathway by changing the water levels as the dungeon opens up, but in practice, it becomes a huge hazard if the player isn't prepared for it. Those are all fair enough reasons to put this dungeon at the bottom of this list, but the truth is, after playing this game so many times, I've learned this area enough to get past that issue. And honestly, I like a lot of these rooms, as well getting around this place might be a pain. Once you get into the bowels of the dungeon, this stage is a lot of fun. There's some pretty epic moments here, like the Dark Link fight, which, even though the actual mini-boss design is kinda cheap, is an awesome moment. And this is the dungeon where you get the long shot, which may not be a unique weapon, as the hook shot has already been a helpful tool for 3 dungeons, including this one, but upgrading its reach is very helpful, especially against the later stage enemies. I don't find the boss fight against Morpha to be that great in all honesty, but it's a decent enough capstone on the dungeon. All in all, while I understand and agree with many of the complaints about the Water Temple, it is hard for me to look down on it anymore. Its simple yet effective aesthetics and solid puzzles make up for any confusion and frustration from its layout. And even though I think many of the other dungeons are better, it is an area that I enjoy playing through. Number 7. Ganons Castle. This is a uniquely frustrating entry on this list because for as much as Ganons Castle gets right, it also gets quite a few things wrong, leading to a generally good but sometimes poor finale. The build-up once you have all the medallions and the light arrows really sets the mood, and the area just outside of it is one of my favorite places in the game visually. I love the contrast between the bright and tranquil exterior of Hyrule Castle and the foreboding and menacing exterior of Ganons Castle. That's a juxtaposition that continues inside this place, as you can feel the evil energy emanating from every corner. And while we never get to explore the inside of Hyrule Castle all that much, we can imagine how different this place really feels. Now, most of my issues with Ganons Castle stem from one aspect: the trials. These should feel like an epic culmination of all your skills to this point, using past dungeons and puzzles and adding to them to test you in different ways. But the problem is, only half of the trials achieve that, and the others fall apart hard as a result. Some of these do work well: the dangerous lethal lava land-esque room of the fire trial, navigating across the platforms in the shadow trial, and the devious puzzles of the spirit trial. Those are all great. Getting the gold gauntlets isn't particularly thrilling, as it is just a strength upgrade, but at the very least it lets you get double defense, which is pretty nice. The rest of them, while not bad challenges on their own, don't tie into their respective element all that well. The light trial is a confusing hodgepodge. A lot of the rooms in this section feel pretty lacking. Especially this one. There is no reason for this room to exist. The forest trial features a room with a bunch of wind generators that did not appear in the forest temple, and the water trial brings back challenges from the ice cavern rather than the water temple. Not to mention the whole room being covered with ice. Before you bring it up, I am aware that the forest and water medallions have emblems that resemble wind and ice, and that they were likely originally the wind and ice temples, but in the final version they're not, so that weakens the impact. But while the trials are a mixed bag, it's the final stretch that cements this dungeon as a classic. The slowly building organ music that gets louder and louder as you climb the tower, the mini-boss gauntlet featuring some of the toughest enemies in the game, the dark church aesthetic and stained glass windows and red carpet, all leading to the showdown against Ganondorf, which, while not that difficult, is a ridiculously fun fight. And it's all capped off with an awesome final fight against Ganon, making this climax end on an incredibly high note. But while Ganon's Castle is buoyed pretty hard by the final boss battles, there are some good elements in the dungeon itself that ultimately gives it a leg up. Not enough to break the top half of the list, but enough to save it from its worser aspects. Number 6, the Forest Temple. This is the first of these levels that I would overall say is at least good in all of its elements. But at the same time, the Forest Temple doesn't really elevate above just hitting all the right marks, as I don't think there's much that really wows me playing it again. It is a solid dungeon, easing you into Adult Link and doing a serviceable job at challenging the player. For many, this would be the first time that you understand Adult Link's power increase, as the first enemies you encounter are Wolfos and Skulltulas, which you've fought multiple times before, but can take down much easier with the Master Sword. I mentioned earlier how the adult dungeons are more built up and lived in, and the Forest Temple is your first taste of that. Sure, you maybe had some man-made, or I guess Goron-made structures in Dongos Cavern, but in the Forest Temple, you have things like curtains, railings, and wooden doors that make this feel like, well, an actual temple. And unlike the drones and synthetic noises of the child dungeon themes, this one highlights actual instruments like a pan flute, percussive keyboards, and human voices, leading to an eerie backing track. Despite the handcrafted architecture, though, this place doesn't hold your hand when it comes to showing you where to go next. This might be the most obvious dungeon in the game that guides you to your next destination by way of attrition, i.e. blocking off all pathways but one until you have the items necessary. You could argue that this design hinders exploration and makes the dungeon too linear, but given the dense and compact layout of this place, I think that's for the best. There's a lot of rooms in the Forest Temple, and they don't always feel well connected to each other, so creating all these barriers for players to slowly overcome was a wise decision. I can see how this level might be too confusing for some, as it can feel a little cluttered and repetitive. The two open rooms in the back of the temple, for instance, look very similar to each other. That can cause you to feel like you've double-backed when you've actually made progress. Hunting down the Poe sisters is a cool concept that works well as a sort of checkpoint system, but the actual Poe fights are nothing to write home about. Phantom Ganon is another fairly pitiful boss. I love the idea of a puppet that mimics Ganondorf's movements and attacks, but in hindsight, it feels more like training for the final fight, as well as how to use your new bow. On that subject, while the bow is great, I feel like its status is weakened because it's identical to the slingshot. The hookshot, by comparison, is an awesome weapon that, and this is the key point, gives Adult Link a new gameplay mechanic, whereas the bow is just a slingshot, but stronger and faster. If the order you got these weapons was reversed, I think the Forest Temple could have been stronger, as you could design more puzzles around the hookshot rather than the relatively few in the Forest Temple. Those might be nitpicks, sure, but it means that while this dungeon is very fun to explore, it ultimately doesn't leave you with too much to look back on fondly. Number 5. Inside the Deu Tree. I am ready to admit that putting this dungeon this far up on the list is mostly nostalgia on my part, as this area specifically formed one of my core gaming memories from childhood. It took me way longer than I'd like to admit to figure out how to break through the spider web in the first room. And I mean, the game literally spells out what to do for you, so I do not know what my problem was, but beating that challenge was exhilarating. So sure, most of my Ocarina of Time memories from that time period were just of the Kokiri Forest and the first half of the Deu Tree. But now that I'm not a stupid kiddo, I'm able to look past that and view this dungeon more objectively. And this is a really great introduction to the game. It is a very simple dungeon with only a couple of rooms to explore, and unless you're a big dum-dum like me, you can clear it in no time. There is quite a bit of tutorializing here, which is helpful for newer players, but it can be aggravating when playing this dungeon again. Navi interrupting you to teach you how to climb walls or open doors might be one of the reasons why longtime players have such an issue with her, if the cries of "hey" and "listen" didn't ward them off already. And this dungeon is pretty damn easy, my puzzle solving skills notwithstanding. There's nothing in here that's taxing on the brain, a lot of the solutions are laid out to you very plainly. And the boss Goma is a complete joke. She looks intimidating, but if you're paying attention, she never gets the opportunity to strike you. But when you look past the first dungeon problems, inside the Deu Tree is a pretty sweet stage to begin your journey. First of all, it's great that you get to this dungeon very quickly, serving as the first real bit of gameplay after Kokiri Forest gets you accustomed to the controls. This was the first 3D Zelda game in an era where the third dimension was still unfamiliar in many ways, so while sending players into a dungeon almost immediately might have been daunting to some, the challenges contained within are just solvable enough for a beginner, and most of the enemies can be dealt with in short work. The slingshot is a great item to get for your first reward, as it's your first ranged attack that deals a solid amount of damage for Child Link, and it's used for both combat and puzzle solving, showing you its versatility right away. On a conceptual level, exploring the interior of the Deu Tree, a character Link has just met, is an odd choice for the first major objective. And while it may not make sense in the lore why a dungeon filled with mechanical obstacles is here, it does look awesome. And that music, this is one of my favorite tracks in the entire game. It's moody, mysterious, atmospheric, and maybe unnerving on some level, but also very soothing. In summation, inside the Deu Tree is a fantastic way to start this grand adventure, even if its tutorial-heavy nature means it's not the best child dungeon in the game. That honor goes to... Number 4, the Dongos Cavern. While the child dungeons have been up and down on this list, the Dongos Cavern stands heads and shoulders above the rest. I love this place. It is immediately darker and more threatening than Deu Tree, as its dark ambient music track hits you right out of the gate with an uninviting vibe. And sure, this is shared with Death Mountain Crater and other caves, so it isn't exactly unique, but it fits the context of the dungeon and immediately sets you on edge, especially once you see the main room. This dungeon is still fairly easy since it's only the second one in the game, but it at least ramps up the challenge from the Deu Tree in ways that the rest of the game will run with. More terrifying enemies, more object-based puzzles, perilous walkways. This dungeon has a little bit of everything. The Dongos Cavern isn't so much hard as it is dangerous to explore unprepared. There's nothing quite like the frustration of losing your Kokiri shield to the fire keys, especially if you didn't see them coming. And the lava floors and high walkways especially are nail-biting to walk around. That doesn't extend to the boss fight though, because King Dodongo is a pushover, even more so than Goma. Sure, he is big and mean and leaves you very little room to navigate lest you walk into the lava pit and take damage, but his attacks are way too slow and he goes down far too quickly. Still, what this dungeon lacks in difficulty, it makes up for in its design. This is the best laid out dungeon on the list so far, where it is technically linear and railroady, but you never feel like that's the case because the path you take loops you back to the main room often, just in different areas. That giant Dodongo skeleton is an excellent landmark, and venturing into its mouth after bombing its eyes makes for a fantastic last sprint. Speaking of bombing the eyes, the bombs and the bomb bag are one reason why this dungeon is so fantastic. As any Ocarina player knows, bombs are an excellent item, useful for clearing out rooms and opening the way forward. But I also like that the game gives you a preview of what they're about with the bomb flowers. They may be slower and less wieldy because they're only in certain locations, but you get a taste for what's to come before the bomb bag gives you that ability to use anywhere. You could argue that the bomb flowers make getting your own bombs feel less like a new tool and more like an upgrade. But even if that's technically the case, bombs are such a fantastic upgrade that makes that argument moot. With an awesome item, some really great challenges, an engrossing atmosphere, and a couple of solid mini-bosses with the Lizalfos, there's not a lot to dislike in Dongos Cavern, and makes things just a little bit tougher to be a step up from the previous tasks, but mostly uses the theme and aesthetics to its advantage by showing you how serious this game's areas can be. The fact that Link heads into this level without batting an eye is a testament to his courage, even as a young boy, letting the child dungeons leave this list on a very high note. Number 3, the Shadow Temple. You know, I've never considered the Shadow Temple all that terrifying. Yes, there are skeletons lying around, and the boss is pretty creepy, but while this dungeon looks cool, it isn't that unnerving, even for N64 standards. Not even the music track is all that spooky, and actually, I don't really care for this track all that much to begin with. For a dungeon that's themed around death and is brimming with a cold and lifeless color palette, there just isn't that much in here that feels scary, except for Dead Hand, but I already talked about him. But I think this is actually to the Shadow Temple's advantage. It uses the concept of death not to frighten the player, but to suck them into a mysterious and haunted location that is meant to sow doubts about your ability to proceed. This place does look awesome, with a bunch of disturbing looking rooms and mechanics, and tons of secrets for you to find using the Lens of Truth. This dungeon uses that item really well, making its hiding places just obvious enough so you aren't lost, but also placing these invisible objects in ways so that you don't expect what's next. People hate the Water Temple for having to equip and re-equip the Iron Boots so often, but theoretically, the Shadow Temple has the same problem with the Hover Boots, yet this temple doesn't get as much ire. Why is that? Well, you don't need the Hover Boots for as much as the Shadow Temple, and if you're okay with a loss of traction, it's perfectly fine to play through most of the Shadow Temple with the Hover Boots on, as you don't lose most of your speed. Another reason is that while the Water Temple mainly uses its boots to get you from room to room, the Shadow Temple incorporates it into more objectives, making it a much more useful tool. Getting across this gap is fun. Walking down these hallways is not. Frankly, if you want to complain about anything in the Shadow Temple, you might complain about how overly long it is. There's tons of rooms in this place, with lots of long hallways connecting everything. It isn't hard to navigate, and your way forward is always clear, but they definitely could have cut 1 or 2 areas from this dungeon. Still, it doesn't make it into the number 3 spot for nothing, because while I take some issue with its length, everything else in this dungeon works. The visuals are outstanding, there's a great degree of challenge and puzzle solving, and there's always something new to test your skills around every corner. In addition, I really like the boss Bongo Bongo. Admittedly, a silly name, but this beast is intimidating. The fact that it sort of extends and fades into the ceiling makes this spirit seem gargantuan, and while he isn't too hard to fight, he does take quite a beating. If it were just tightened up a little bit, the Shadow Temple had a shot of making it to number 2, possibly number 1, but this is still an excellent temple and a great penultimate dungeon before Ganons Castle. Number 2, the Fire Temple. This is perhaps the most consistently excellent dungeon in the game, as there's nothing really wrong with the Fire Temple. It has perhaps the perfect balance of challenge, scale, and mental obstacles of all the game's dungeons, making it an easy top contender for the top 5 on any person's list, I imagine. As this place is built into a volcano, the heat and lava elements naturally take over in many rooms. You'll definitely take a spill into the magma if you're not careful, but even with the firewalls and totems spitting flames at you later on, this dungeon doesn't lean too heavily on its theme. Well enough to be memorable, not enough to be overbearing. I also really love the way this level is designed, which, given my history with and disdain for vertical levels, is surprising. This is the tallest dungeon in the game, with the possible exception of Ganons Castle, stretching across 5 floors and forcing you to go all the way up and then back down to proceed. But it manages to shake the faults of vertical levels by being very linear and straightforward, as well as having convenient shortcuts in case you do fall down by accident. It's easy enough to track your progress thanks to the process of rescuing all the Gorons, as finding either a cage or a switch gives you a clue that something important is nearby. Also, I love that once you've climbed to the highest point of the temple and explored everything, you can immediately make it back to the boss door by smacking this pillar down with your hammer. I appreciate that a lot. This is one of the instances where you get the major item late in the dungeon, as the hammer doesn't quite get as much use as the others, both inside and outside the Fire Temple. But it is incredibly clever that the room containing the boss key is locked behind an obstacle that only the hammer can break, as once you realize that the hammer is the solution and head back down, you know immediately where to go next. It's also incorporated well into the fight with Volvalgia, which is pretty slow, especially with how he flies around for most of it, but feels epic nonetheless. There are quite a few ways in which the Fire Temple could have been more annoying than it actually is, but the level designers basically nailed this one. To be honest, the last two dungeons were pretty hard to decide between, and I think the Fire Temple lost the edge just because of the music. I vastly prefer the original version with the chanting. The remixed version isn't terrible, but the synthetic singing is nowhere near as atmospheric. But even though the temple itself only takes the silver medal, it is a fantastic addition to the game and a very well designed level worthy of its high ranking. Number 1. The Spirit Temple. I don't think these top 3 picks were especially controversial, as I get the feeling that most Ocarina of Time players rate the Shadow, Fire, and Spirit Temples very highly. For my money, the Spirit Temple represents the best of everything this game has to offer. Not only is it an excellent culmination of the game's challenges and design, but it has the cleverest layout and puzzles and some of the best objectives in the entire game. It's clear right from the start that this is something special, as your first trip to the dungeon blocks you off until you return to this area as Child Link. Splitting the dungeon into a child and adult section, which some might find an unnecessary divide, makes this dungeon feel far grander, as if it's bridging that gap between these two parts of Link's journey. The two areas don't intersect with each other all that much, which might seem like more of a negative, but considering how inconvenient it would be to warp back to the Temple of Time and walk up to the Master Sword pedestal just to solve one task, it's definitely for the best. If the bottom of the well is the most mentally challenging child dungeon, the Spirit Temple is definitely the most dangerous, with plenty of harder encounters to deal with. I also like how these two sections of the dungeon mirror each other in some ways, but also not being afraid to split off into their own thing to test child and adult Link with separate tasks. That makes it feel like a more tailored final test, which I think works extremely well. And props for making the duller yellow and orange colors palette look genuinely outstanding. It's hard for me to get invested in a lot of desert-themed areas, but this temple has some awesome visuals. Then there's the music, which is, hands down, the best dungeon theme in this game, and I don't think it really comes close. While I love many of the other themes for their ambient drones, or for their mysterious pads and stings, this song is much more of a complete melody, dripping with a spectral and inviting energy that sounds absolutely beautiful. A definite highlight of the dungeon for sure. Maybe the only knock against Spirit Temple is its items, particularly the silver gauntlets, which feel pretty underutilized. Pushing heavier blocks around just isn't that exciting, especially since block pushing puzzles have been a thing in every other adult dungeon thus far. The mirror shield fares much better, both because it looks awesome, and because it gives Link a unique light shining and reflecting ability without taking away his defense. It's also used to pretty great effect in the Twin Rova fight, which, while not my favorite boss in the game, is very enjoyable once you get the groove down right. The Spirit Temple maybe has more noticeable flaws than the Fire Temple, especially in its items and some of its challenges feeling less than perfectly optimized, but I enjoy the dungeon's positive aspects too much to let those low points drag it down. It has always stood out to me as a phenomenal level that encapsulates everything that's fantastic about this game, and is my pick for the best dungeon in Ocarina of Time. Hey there, it's me again, Cloud Connection, from the future, but from a different part of the future now. Normally this is the part where I would say like, comment, and subscribe, and I do hope you do all these things, but of course, as I said at the beginning of this video, this channel will be ending soon, and I will have a new channel up and running later in the year. I do plan to make a video explaining all of that and introducing the new channel in full, so if you want to see that, do make sure you subscribe, because it is the best way you'll get notified when that change happens. It should happen pretty soon. I'm aiming for mid-April, but we'll see. Until that time, I'm Cloud Connection for now, and I'll see you all later.